Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Vanishing Heirloom. Chapter 1. The Empty Jewellery Box. The invitation to tea at Thornfield Manor arrived on a Tuesday morning, written in Mrs. Constance Weatherby's familiar spidery hand. Miss Jane Marple, settling into her favourite chair by the window with her knitting, read the brief but urgent note with growing concern. "Do come at once, dear Jane," it concluded. "I find myself in the most dreadful predicament." Miss Marple had known Constance Weatherby for the better part of 40 years. Ever since they had served together on the church flower committee, she was not a woman given to dramatics or unnecessary alarm. If Constance described her situation as dreadful, then dreadful it most certainly was. The afternoon found Miss Marple walking up the gravel drive to Thornfield Manor, her keen blue eyes taking in the well-maintained gardens and the solid Georgian facade that spoke of old money and established respectability. The house had been in the Weatherby family for 3 generations, a testament to prudent marriages and careful stewardship of inherited wealth. Mrs. Weatherby herself answered the door, and Miss Marple was immediately struck by the change in her old friend's appearance. Usually immaculately groomed and serenely composed, Constance looked positively haggard. Her silver hair, typically arranged with mathematical precision, showed signs of nervous fingering, and her pale blue eyes bore the telltale redness of recent tears. "Oh, Jane, thank goodness you've come," Mrs. Weatherby exclaimed, grasping Miss Marple's gloved hands with both of her own. "I simply don't know what to do. It's gone, you see. Completely gone." "What's gone, my dear Constance?" Miss Marple inquired gently, allowing herself to be led into the familiar drawing-room with its chintz-covered furniture and portraits of long-dead Weatherbys gazing sternly from gilt frames. "Mother's emerald necklace," Mrs. Weatherby replied, sinking into her chair as though the admission had drained her of strength. "The family heirloom. It's vanished from my jewellery box, and I simply cannot fathom how." Miss Marple settled herself carefully, her knitting bag placed precisely beside her chair. She had learned long ago that the best way to encourage confidences was to appear completely absorbed in one's needlework while listening with every fibre of one's being. "When did you discover it was missing?" she asked, her fingers already busy with the pale blue wool that would eventually become a jacket for her great-nephew. "Yesterday evening," Mrs. Weatherby replied, dabbing at her eyes with a lace-edged handkerchief. "I went to my jewellery box to select something suitable for the church charity gala this Saturday. The necklace should have been in its special compartment, but the case was empty. Completely empty." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically as she considered this information. "And when did you last see the necklace?" "Last Sunday after church. I had worn it for the morning service, as I often do. I remember returning it to its proper place." Mrs. Weatherby's voice caught slightly. "Jane, that necklace is worth a considerable sum. It belonged to my dear mother, and before that to her mother. It's been in our family for decades." "I see," Miss Marple murmured. "And who else in the household would have known of its location?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated, her hands twisting the handkerchief. "Well, the family, naturally. My daughter Millicent lives here with me, as you know, and my grandson Timothy returned from university just last month. As for the servants, there's Mrs. Hartwell, who's been our cook-housekeeper for 30 years, and Rose, the housemaid." At that moment, as if summoned by the mention of her name, a nervous-looking woman in her 40s appeared in the doorway. Millicent Weatherby had inherited her mother's delicate bone structure, but none of her poise. She hovered uncertainly, her thin hands fluttering like trapped birds. "Mother, I heard voices. I didn't realize we had a visitor." "You remember Miss Marple, dear," Mrs. Weatherby said with forced brightness. "She's come for tea." Miss Marple observed the younger woman with interest. Millicent's eyes, when they briefly met hers, held a haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and persistent worry. When her mother mentioned the necklace's disappearance, Millicent actually flinched, her already pale complexion growing positively ashen. "Oh," Millicent whispered. "The necklace. Yes. It's terrible, isn't it?" She seemed to shrink into herself. I'll tell Mrs. Hartwell to bring tea." After Millicent had fled, Mrs. Weatherby sighed deeply. "Poor Millicent has been quite beside herself about the whole affair. She's always been sensitive, but this has affected her dreadfully." Miss Marple filed this observation away as Mrs. Hartwell arrived with the tea service. The cook-housekeeper was a capable-looking woman of perhaps 55, with greying hair pulled back severely, and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Behind her came a young woman Miss Marple didn't recognize, presumably Rose, the housemaid. Rose appeared to be in her early 20s, with auburn hair and green eyes that darted nervously about the room. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the tea service as she helped Mrs. Hartwell arrange the cups and saucers, but Miss Marple noticed how her hands trembled slightly, and how she seemed to be listening intently to every word spoken. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell," Mrs. Weatherby said, as the servants prepared to withdraw. "Oh, and please tell Timothy that Miss Marple is here. He'll want to pay his respects." Miss Marple caught the meaningful glance that passed between the two servants before they left the room. In her experience, servants often knew far more about family affairs than their employers realized, and that silent communication suggested they had opinions about the missing necklace that they were keeping to themselves. Timothy Weatherby arrived as his grandmother was pouring the tea. He was a handsome young man of perhaps 22, with the fair hair and blue eyes that seemed to run in the family. However, there was something about his manner, a defensive set to his shoulders, a too bright smile, that immediately put Miss Marple in mind of young Willie Henderson from her own village, who had developed a remarkably similar demeanour after he'd begun gambling away his inheritance at the local horse races. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you again," Timothy said, taking her offered hand with a charm that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm sorry it's under such unfortunate circumstances." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Your grandmother tells me you've recently returned from university." A shadow crossed Timothy's face. "Yes, Cambridge. Finished my degree in June." He accepted a cup of tea from his grandmother, but Miss Marple noticed how his hand shook slightly, causing the cup to rattle against the saucer. Mrs. Weatherby continued her account. "The jewellery box shows no signs of forced entry, Jane. It's the most peculiar thing. I keep it locked, naturally, but the spare key was exactly where it should be, in Charles's old desk drawer." "And who knew about the spare key?" Miss Marple inquired. "Only family members," Mrs. Weatherby replied firmly. "Charles, my late husband, always kept important keys in that particular drawer. It's been family practice for years." Miss Marple observed Timothy's reaction to this statement. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she was reminded of young Tom Richardson, who'd had precisely that expression when caught raiding the church poor box to fund his gambling habits. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who was shown in by a clearly flustered Mrs. Hartwell. The inspector, a man of middle years with a perpetually harried expression, nodded curtly to Miss Marple before turning his attention to Mrs. Weatherby. "Now then, madam," he began, producing a notebook from his breast pocket. "I understand you've had a theft. Valuable necklace, is it?" Mrs. Weatherby repeated her story while Inspector Slack took notes with the air of a man who had heard similar tales countless times before. Miss Marple continued with her knitting, but her sharp ears caught every nuance of tone and inflection. Sounds straightforward enough, the inspector concluded. Family piece goes missing from locked box. Only family knows where the key is kept. Usually finds it someone with debts to pay or expensive habits to fund. His gaze lingered meaningfully on Timothy, who flushed but said nothing. After Inspector Slack had departed to examine the jewellery box more thoroughly, Miss Marple found herself drawn to Mrs. Weatherby's bedroom. The room was elegantly appointed, but showed signs of recent disturbance. Drawers pulled out slightly, papers scattered on the dressing table. The jewellery box itself sat on the dressing table, an ornate affair of rosewood and mother-of-pearl. Miss Marple examined it carefully, her trained eye noting several curious details. Fresh scratches around the lock suggested recent tampering, though they were subtle enough to have been missed by a casual observer. More intriguingly, she detected a faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. "Do you use lavender water, Constance?" she asked casually. Mrs. Weatherby looked puzzled. "Lavender? No, I've never cared for it. Too reminiscent of old ladies' sachets, I always thought." Yet the scent was definitely present and recent. Miss Marple filed this detail away as she continued her examination. On her way back downstairs, she noticed muddy footprints on the back stairs. Small, neat prints that definitely belonged to a woman, but they didn't match any of the shoes she had observed on the household members that afternoon. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Mrs. Weatherby alone, staring into the fire with a troubled expression. "Constance," she said gently, settling back into her chair, "tell me about the necklace's history. You mentioned it belonged to your mother." Mrs. Weatherby's expression grew thoughtful. "Yes, dear mother treasured it above all her possessions. She was a nurse, you know, before she married father. The necklace was given to her by a patient, a wealthy lady for whom she had cared during a long and difficult illness. Mother always said the poor woman had no family to leave it to, and wanted it to go to someone who would treasure it." "How generous," Miss Marple murmured, though something in Mrs. Weatherby's tone suggested there was more to the story than she was revealing. "Mother was always rather private about the exact circumstances," Mrs. Weatherby continued. "She would only say that it was given in gratitude for devoted service, and that it should be treasured as a symbol of service to others." As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple learned more about the household dynamics. Mrs. Weatherby mentioned, with obvious distress, that she had recently updated her will, leaving the emerald necklace specifically to Millicent. This had caused some family discord, as Timothy had apparently expected to inherit it. "I felt it was appropriate," Mrs. Weatherby explained defensively. "Millicent has never married, never had the security of a husband's protection. The necklace seemed like a suitable inheritance for her." Miss Marple nodded understandingly, though she couldn't help but notice how this revelation might provide a motive for several members of the household. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Weatherby walked her to the door. "Jane," she said quietly, "there's something else. Someone has been in the attic. I discovered it this morning when I went up to look for some old photographs. Papers were scattered about, and I found this." She pressed a single white glove into Miss Marple's hand, along with a torn photograph showing what appeared to be a young woman in nurse's uniform. "I've never seen this glove before," Mrs. Weatherby whispered. "And this photograph, I think it might be of Mother, but it's been torn deliberately. Someone has been searching through our family papers, Jane. But why?" Miss Marple examined the glove, expensive leather, barely worn, and definitely not belonging to anyone she had met in the household that day. The photograph, though damaged, showed a young woman with intelligent eyes and a determined chin. There was something about her expression that reminded Miss Marple of someone, though she couldn't quite place who. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's revelations. The missing necklace was clearly only part of a larger puzzle, one that seemed to reach back into the family's past. The nervous tension she had observed in both Millicent and Timothy, the meaningful glances between the servants, the evidence of someone searching through family papers, All of these elements suggested a mystery far more complex than a simple theft. She thought of her own village experiences with similar cases. There had been the matter of Mrs. Cresswell's missing brooch, which had ultimately revealed a 30-year-old secret about illegitimate parentage, and the curious affair of the Hendersons' stolen silver, which had uncovered a web of family blackmail dating back 2 generations. In Miss Marple's experience, when valuable family heirlooms went missing, the theft itself was often secondary to the secrets that lay beneath the surface of respectable family life. And judging by the undercurrents of tension she had observed at Thornfield Manor, there were definitely secrets waiting to be uncovered. The emerald necklace, she suspected, was merely the key that would unlock a door that someone, perhaps several someones, was desperate to keep closed. Before we continue, I'm your host, Elliot, and welcome to Warm Pages. It's truly beautiful how these stories connect us no matter where in the world we are. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and if you're enjoying the story so far, feel free to leave a like. It really helps. Now, settle in with your coffee or tea, and let's continue. Chapter 2, A Grandmother's Legacy. Miss Marple spent a restless night turning over the events at Thornfield Manor in her mind. Experience had taught her that first impressions, while valuable, often obscured as much as they revealed. The torn photograph and white glove lay on her bedside table, silent witnesses to mysteries that reached beyond a simple theft. The following morning found her in the village records office, a dusty repository of local history housed in what had once been the grain merchant's storehouse. Mrs. Trimble, the elderly clerk, welcomed Miss Marple with the enthusiasm of one seldom visited in her domain of ledgers and filing cabinets. "Looking into family histories, are we, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Trimble inquired, adjusting her spectacles with hands spotted by decades of handling old documents. "Always fascinating what one discovers about the past." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I'm particularly interested in the employment records of nurses from the 1890s. A friend mentioned her grandmother, Sarah Pemberton, who worked for several prominent families in the area." Mrs. Trimble's face brightened with professional interest. "Ah, yes, the nursing records. We had quite complete files from that period, thanks to the cottage hospital's meticulous record-keeping." She disappeared into the maze of shelves, returning with a leather-bound volume. "Here we are. Pemberton, you said." Miss Marple settled herself at the reading table, her keen eyes scanning the faded entries. Sarah Pemberton's record painted a picture of a devoted and capable woman who had served in the finest houses of the district. The Hendersons of Oak Lodge, the Cartwrights at Millfield House, and finally the Ashfords of Ashford Hall. It was the final entry that caught Miss Marple's attention. Sarah Pemberton had been employed at Ashford Hall from March 1894 to December 1895, caring for Miss Eleanor Ashford during what was described as a prolonged and delicate illness. The notation in the margin, written in a different hand, was particularly intriguing. Patient deceased December 1895. No surviving family. Estate to distant cousins. Yet something about these dates troubled Miss Marple. If Eleanor Ashford had died in December 1895, why had Sarah Pemberton's employment continued for several months afterward? She made a mental note to investigate further. Her contemplation was interrupted by Mrs. Trimble, who had returned with another volume. "I thought you might find this interesting," the clerk said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Ashford family papers were donated to us years ago when the hall was sold. Fascinating reading, if you're interested in local history." Miss Marple accepted the additional volume with gratitude. The Ashford papers revealed a family in decline, with Eleanor being the last of the direct line. Born in 1870, she had been educated abroad and had returned to Ashford Hall in 1893 to care for her aging parents. Both parents had died within a year of her return, leaving Eleanor as the sole heir to a considerable fortune. What intrigued Miss Marple was the gap in the family correspondence. Letters dated through early 1894 painted a picture of an active young woman involved in local charitable works. Then, quite suddenly, the correspondence ceased for nearly 2 years, resuming only with Eleanor's obituary and the settlement of her estate. "Most peculiar," Miss Marple murmured to herself, unconsciously echoing words she had heard many times in her own village when faced with unexplained gaps in otherwise orderly lives. Her research was interrupted by the arrival of Timothy Weatherby, who appeared at the records office door looking both surprised and somewhat disconcerted to find her there. "Miss Marple," he said, attempting his charming smile, but not quite succeeding. "How unexpected to see you here." "Good morning, Timothy," she replied pleasantly. "I find local history quite fascinating. Are you interested in genealogy as well?" A flush crept up Timothy's neck. "Not exactly. I was hoping to find some information about property values in the area. For a friend," he added hastily. Miss Marple's experience with young men of Timothy's type, and she was reminded particularly of her nephew Raymond during his unfortunate gambling phase, suggested that this explanation was less than truthful. Young men researching property values for mysterious friends were usually young men researching the value of family assets for less respectable purposes. "How thoughtful of you," she said mildly. "I'm sure your grandmother appreciates having such a considerate grandson." Timothy's expression grew uncomfortable. "Yes, well, grandmother has been under tremendous strain lately. This business with the necklace has quite upset her." After Timothy had departed, clutching several property assessment documents, Miss Marple returned to her research with renewed purpose. The Ashford papers contained one more significant revelation, a letter from the family solicitor dated January 1896, just weeks after Eleanor's supposed death, inquiring about the disposition of Miss Ashford's personal effects, particularly those items of sentimental value that were not included in the formal inventory. Miss Marple closed the record books with a growing sense that the emerald necklace's history was far more complex than Mrs. Weatherby had indicated. The timing of Sarah Pemberton's employment, the gaps in the Ashford family records, and the solicitor's inquiry about missing personal effects all suggested a story that had been carefully obscured. Her afternoon was spent in a visit to Dr. Haydock, who had been the village physician for nearly 30 years, and was a reliable source of both medical knowledge and village gossip. She found him in his surgery, reviewing patient files with a methodical precision that had made him a trusted figure in the community. "Miss Marple," he greeted her warmly, "I trust you're not here as a patient." "Indeed not, Doctor. I was hoping you might have some knowledge of the Ashford family medical history." "I understand your predecessor, Doctor Morrison, attended them." Dr. Haydock's expression grew thoughtful. "Ah, yes, old Morrison. He left quite detailed records, actually." A bit of a perfectionist, was Morrison. Never saw a case he didn't document thoroughly. He moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder. "The Ashfords, you said?" "Yes, here we are." Miss Marple waited patiently as Dr. Haydock reviewed the files. She had learned that medical men, like clergymen, possessed information that could illuminate the darkest corners of family secrets, but they required a careful handling to share what they knew. "Curious case, Eleanor Ashford," Dr. Haydock said finally. "Morrison attended the family for years, but his notes about Eleanor's final illness are, well, rather unusual." "In what way?" Dr. Haydock hesitated, clearly weighing professional discretion against natural curiosity. Morrison noted that Miss Ashford suffered from what he termed nervous exhaustion and complications arising from a delicate condition. The terminology suggests, well, in those days, such language often referred to conditions that required considerable privacy. Miss Marple understood immediately. In the 1890s, delicate conditions requiring privacy and extended seclusion usually meant only one thing: an unmarried woman expecting a child. "I see," she said quietly. "And the duration of her illness?" "Nearly 2 years, according to Morrison's notes. Most unusual for a simple case of nervous exhaustion." Dr. Haydock replaced the file carefully. Morrison also noted that he attended a birth in the district during that period. Unusual, because he normally referred such cases to the midwife, but he made no notation about the patient's identity. As Miss Marple walked home through the village, she reflected on the pattern that was beginning to emerge. Eleanor Ashford's mysterious illness, Sarah Pemberton's extended employment, and the careful obscurity surrounding both situations suggested a secret that had been protected for decades. Her contemplation was interrupted by the sight of Millicent Weatherby, sitting alone on a bench in the churchyard, staring at the headstones with an expression of profound melancholy. Miss Marple approached her with the gentle caution one might use with a frightened animal. "Good afternoon, Millicent," she said softly, settling beside the younger woman on the bench. Millicent started as though awakened from a dream. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." "I was just walking through. Such a peaceful spot, isn't it?" Miss Marple's voice carried the soothing quality that had calmed many troubled souls over the years. "Yes," Millicent whispered. "I often come here to think, especially lately with all this trouble about the necklace." Miss Marple waited, her knitting needles clicking gently in the afternoon stillness. Experience had taught her that silence was often more productive than questions. "I keep thinking about family," Millicent continued, her voice barely audible, "about inheritance and what we pass down to our children. Sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be better if certain things were simply forgotten." "The past has a way of making itself known," Miss Marple observed gently. "Rather like weeds in a garden. The more one tries to suppress them, the more vigorously they tend to grow." Millicent turned to look at her with eyes that held a depth of worry that seemed far beyond the simple matter of a stolen necklace. "Do you think, Miss Marple, that sins can be inherited, that the mistakes of one generation can poison the next?" "I think," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that secrets often cause more harm than the truths they're meant to conceal. And I've observed that those who worry most about inherited sins are usually the most innocent of any wrongdoing." Millicent's eyes filled with tears. "Mother doesn't know how much I've discovered about Grandmother Sarah's past, about the questions people have been asking, the letters I've been receiving. Someone knows, Miss Marple. Someone knows the truth about our family and they want something from us." Before Miss Marple could respond, Millicent had risen and hurried away, leaving behind only the lingering scent of lavender water and the echo of her troubled words. As evening settled over the village, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting abandoned in her lap. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture, though much remained obscure. Eleanor Ashford's mysterious illness, Sarah Pemberton's convenient employment, and now Millicent's revelation about threatening letters all pointed to a secret that someone was determined to exploit. She thought of similar cases from her village experience, the Hendersons and their carefully concealed family scandal, the Pritchards and their desperate attempts to hide an inconvenient marriage. In each case, the truth had eventually emerged, often with consequences far different from what the secret keepers had feared. The emerald necklace, she was becoming convinced, was not simply stolen property, but evidence in a much larger game of family secrets and hidden inheritance. Someone had discovered the truth about the Ashford-Pemberton connection and was using that knowledge for their own purposes. The question now was whether that someone was inside the Weatherby household or working from without, and whether their ultimate goal was money, revenge, or something else entirely. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Attic. Miss Marple arrived at Thornfield Manor the following morning with the stated purpose of returning a recipe book Mrs. Weatherby had lent her some weeks prior. In truth, the book could have waited indefinitely for its return, but Miss Marple had awakened with a peculiar certainty that the attic held more secrets than a single white glove and torn photograph. Mrs. Weatherby received her with evident gratitude, the strain of recent events having carved deeper lines around her eyes. "Oh, Jane, how thoughtful of you to call. I confess I've been quite beside myself since yesterday. Millicent has taken to her room with one of her nervous headaches, and Timothy seems perpetually absent on mysterious errands." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested delicately, "I might help you sort through those disturbed papers in the attic. Often a fresh pair of eyes can spot what's been overlooked." Mrs. Weatherby's face brightened with relief. "Would you? I must admit, the task has seemed rather overwhelming. There are decades of family documents up there, and whoever searched through them showed little regard for organization." The attic of Thornfield Manor was reached by a narrow staircase behind the servants' quarters. As they climbed, Miss Marple noted the absence of dust on the banister, evidence of recent and repeated use. The attic itself was a long, low-ceilinged room with dormer windows that cast rectangular patches of light across the scattered contents. Someone had indeed conducted a systematic search. Trunks stood open, their contents spilled across the floor in careless heaps. Filing boxes had been upended, their papers sorted into rough piles. It was the work of someone looking for specific documents rather than valuables. "Goodness," Mrs. Weatherby murmured, surveying the chaos. "It's worse than I remembered." Miss Marple moved carefully through the debris, her trained eye cataloguing the types of documents that had been disturbed. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, and correspondence dating back nearly a century lay scattered about. But it was what she found in a mahogany trunk near the far window that made her pause. Partially concealed beneath a stack of old photographs was a birth certificate that had somehow escaped the searcher's notice. The parchment was yellowed with age and bore the official seal of the district registry office. The name recorded was Sarah Eleanor Pemberton, born March 15th, 1894. The space for the father's name contained only the word unknown. Miss Marple studied the document with growing fascination. Sarah Eleanor, the same Sarah who would become Mrs. Weatherby's mother, and the same Eleanor as the mysterious Ashford daughter who had supposedly died unmarried and childless. "Constance," she called softly, "might you look at this?" Mrs. Weatherby approached and examined the certificate with puzzlement. "I don't understand. This shows Mother's birth date as 1894, but that's impossible. Mother was born in 1870. I've seen her birth certificate many times." "Are you quite certain?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Weatherby's face grew pale as the implications began to dawn on her. "But if this is correct, then Mother would have been... She would have been only a year old when she supposedly began working as a nurse. That's impossible." Miss Marple continued her examination of the trunk's contents, while Mrs. Weatherby struggled with this revelation. Hidden in a small velvet bag at the very bottom, she discovered a collection of letters tied with faded ribbon. The paper was of high quality, and the handwriting was educated, clearly from someone of good breeding. The letters were addressed to "My dearest E" and signed simply R. The dates ranged from 1893 to early 1894, and their contents painted a picture of a passionate but clandestine romance. "My darling Eleanor," one letter began, "the necessity of secrecy grows more burdensome each day. If only circumstances were different, if only my position allowed me to declare my feelings openly." Another letter, dated several months later, contained more urgent concerns. "My beloved, I am deeply troubled by your recent news. You know that my feelings for you are unchanged, but the complications this presents, we must think carefully about the best course of action." The final letter in the collection was brief and heartrending. "Dearest Eleanor, by the time you read this, arrangements will have been made. The child will be placed with good people who will raise her as their own. It is the only way to protect both your reputation and my position. Please forgive me for what must seem like abandonment, but I see no other path that does not lead to scandal for us both." Mrs. Weatherby read the letters with growing amazement and distress. "Jane, what does this mean? Are these letters to Eleanor Ashford, and who is this R?" Miss Marple was already forming theories, but she kept them to herself for the moment. Instead, she continued her methodical search through the scattered papers. Near the window, she discovered additional documents that had been partially concealed beneath an overturned box. Among these was a letter from a firm of solicitors in London, dated 1895, acknowledging receipt of certain personal effects belonging to the late Miss Eleanor Ashford, to be transferred to the guardianship of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Pemberton as arranged. The letter specifically mentioned one emerald necklace of considerable value, to be held in trust for the child's future benefit. The picture was becoming clearer, though many questions remained. Eleanor Ashford had not died childless. She had given birth to a daughter who was secretly placed with the Pemberton family and raised as their own child. The emerald necklace had not been a grateful patient's gift, but rather Eleanor's own jewellery, provided as part of her daughter's inheritance. "My word," Mrs. Weatherby whispered as she absorbed these revelations. "Mother was Eleanor Ashford's daughter. That makes me, and Millicent. We're Ashford descendants." Miss Marple nodded gravely. Indeed, and it would seem that someone else has discovered this connection and is using the knowledge for their own purposes. As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Hartwell appeared at the top of the attic stairs. The cook-housekeeper's usually composed demeanour showed signs of agitation. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," she said to Mrs. Weatherby, "that there's a gentleman downstairs asking to speak with you. Says it's about family genealogy and quite urgent." Mrs. Weatherby and Miss Marple exchanged meaningful glances. "Did he give his name?" Mrs. Weatherby inquired. "Mr. Roberts, ma'am. Says he's researching local families for a historical society. Very well-spoken gentleman, but—" Mrs. Hartwell hesitated. "But," Miss Marple prompted gently, "well, miss, it's just that he seemed to know rather a lot about the house already. Asked specifically about the attic and whether the family kept old papers up there. Seemed surprised when I told him you were both up here now." Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle of recognition that came when pieces of a puzzle began falling into place. A gentleman researcher appearing just as they discovered crucial family documents was a coincidence too convenient to be accidental. "I think," she said quietly to Mrs. Weatherby, "that we should meet this Mr. Roberts, but perhaps we should first secure these documents safely." They gathered the most important papers, the birth certificate, the letters, and the solicitor's correspondence, and locked them in Mrs. Weatherby's desk downstairs before receiving their unexpected visitor. Mr. Roberts proved to be a distinguished-looking man of perhaps 50, with greying hair and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His manner was courteous but persistent, and Miss Marple noticed how his gaze swept the room as though cataloguing its contents. "Mrs. Weatherby," he began, after the introductions were complete, "I represent a historical society that's compiling a comprehensive record of prominent local families. The Ashford lineage has proven particularly fascinating, and I understand your family may have connections to their history." Mrs. Weatherby, clearly flustered by the timing of this visit, murmured something non-committal about family histories being complicated affairs. "Indeed, they are," Mr. Roberts agreed smoothly. "I've been researching the Ashford family extensively, and I've uncovered some rather surprising information about Eleanor Ashford's final years. It appears the official record of her death may have been, shall we say, incomplete." Miss Marple observed Mr. Roberts carefully as he spoke. There was something about his manner, a barely contained eagerness beneath the scholarly facade, that reminded her of Mr. Petherick from her own village, who had made such persistent inquiries about the Henderson family's financial affairs just before their missing silver had mysteriously reappeared in a London pawnshop. "Historical research can be quite rewarding," Miss Marple observed mildly, "though I imagine it requires considerable time and expense to pursue leads that may prove fruitless." Mr. Roberts's eyes sharpened as they focused on her. "Indeed, Miss Marple, though when one discovers evidence of previously unknown family connections, particularly those involving valuable inheritances, the investment can prove quite worthwhile." The threat beneath his polite words was unmistakable. Mr. Roberts knew about the Ashford connection and was prepared to use that knowledge to his advantage. After he departed with promises to return with additional documentation, Mrs. Weatherby sank into her chair with evident exhaustion. "Jane, what are we to do? This man clearly knows about Mother's parentage, and he seems to be suggesting that we have no right to the necklace, or perhaps to more than just the necklace." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand reassuringly. "I think, my dear, that we need to understand exactly what Mr. Roberts hopes to gain from his research. And more importantly, we need to discover how he learned about your family's connection to Eleanor Ashford." As she prepared to leave Thornfield Manor, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern she had observed many times before. Someone had uncovered a family secret and was using that knowledge to manipulate and threaten the current generation. The question was whether their ultimate goal was financial gain, revenge, or something else entirely. One thing was certain: the theft of the emerald necklace was merely the opening move in a much larger and more dangerous game. Chapter 4: The Suspicious Housemaid. Inspector Slack arrived at Thornfield Manor the following morning with the purposeful stride of a man who had finally found a lead worth pursuing. Miss Marple, who had been invited to tea again by Mrs. Weatherby, observed from the drawing-room window as the inspector's motor car came to a decisive halt on the gravel drive. "That young housemaid of yours," Inspector Slack announced without preamble as he entered the room. "She's been telling tales that don't add up. I've had her down at the station for questioning, and her story has more holes than a fishing net." Mrs. Weatherby looked genuinely distressed. "Rose? But she's been with us for several months now. She came with excellent references." "References that bear closer examination," Inspector Slack replied grimly, consulting his notebook. "The girl admits she's been in correspondence with someone in London about your family affairs, claims it was innocent genealogical research, but I've seen enough of these cases to know when someone's been planted in a household for suspicious purposes." Miss Marple continued with her knitting, but her attention was fully focused on the inspector's revelations. She had observed Rose carefully during her visits to the house, and had noted several small inconsistencies in the girl's behavior that had troubled her without her being able to identify precisely why. "What sort of correspondence?" Mrs. Weatherby asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Inspector Slack consulted his notes again. "Letters to a firm of solicitors in London. Hartwell, Griggs and Associates. Seems they specialize in what they call inheritance recovery. The girl was providing them with detailed information about your household routines, the location of valuables, and particulars about your family history." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. She had encountered similar cases in her own village. The matter of young Emma Parsons, who had been hired as a companion to elderly Miss Forthright, and had subsequently provided information that led to a fraudulent will contest. The parallels were unmistakably clear. "The girl claims she thought she was helping with legitimate historical research," Inspector Slack continued, "but the nature of her report suggests otherwise. She was specifically instructed to note details about family documents, photographs, and any mention of the Ashford name." Mrs. Weatherby's face had grown increasingly pale. "The Ashford name? But how could she have known?" "That's precisely what we need to determine," Inspector Slack replied. "The girl's employment agency has no record of her previous positions, and her references appear to have been fabricated. We're dealing with a carefully orchestrated deception." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the inspector with interest. "Has Rose indicated who first approached her about this position?" "Claims she answered an advertisement in The Lady," Inspector Slack replied. "But when we checked with the magazine, no such advertisement was ever placed. Someone sought her out specifically and arranged for her placement in this household." The implications were troubling indeed. Miss Marple reflected on similar cases of domestic infiltration she had observed. Young Mary Pritchard, who had been hired to care for old Mr. Hawkins, and had systematically gathered information about his financial affairs for a nephew who later attempted to contest the will. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her usually composed demeanour showing signs of considerable agitation. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, but I thought you should know. Rose has disappeared. Her room is empty, and she's taken all her belongings." Inspector Slack muttered something under his breath that was distinctly unprintable. "When did you last see her?" "This morning after breakfast," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "She seemed quite nervous and kept glancing toward the windows as though she expected someone. I found this on her dressing table." She held out a small brass key. Miss Marple examined the key with interest. It was old and well made, with intricate scrollwork that suggested it belonged to something of value rather than an ordinary door or drawer. "I don't recognize this key," Mrs. Weatherby said, studying it carefully. "It doesn't match any of the locks in the house." Inspector Slack pocketed the key with professional efficiency. "We'll determine what it opens soon enough. In the meantime, I want to know everything about this girl's behavior," suggesting a widespread network of correspondence. The paper was of good quality, and the handwriting on the addresses appeared educated and feminine. "The gentleman who requested you hold these letters," Miss Marple inquired delicately. "Might you describe him?" Mrs. Jenkins's description matched perfectly with both Mr. Roberts, who had visited Thornfield Manor, and the mysterious gentleman who had been making inquiries throughout the district. Miss Marple's suspicions were rapidly crystallizing into certainty. Her afternoon was spent in conversation with Dr. Haydock, who had returned from a medical conference in London with news that proved most illuminating. "Curious thing, Miss Marple," he said, settling into his study chair with the air of a man who had encountered something professionally intriguing. "I was discussing the Ashford case with a colleague who specializes in medical genealogy. He mentioned that there's been considerable interest lately in the Ashford family medical history, someone conducting research into hereditary conditions." "Medical genealogy?" Miss Marple inquired. "Fascinating field, actually. The study of inherited diseases and family medical patterns. My colleague mentioned that someone has been paying substantial fees to have old medical records authenticated and analyzed, particularly interested in records that might establish biological relationships within families." Miss Marple understood immediately. Someone was not merely claiming connection to the Ashford family, they were attempting to prove it through medical evidence. "Did your colleague mention who was conducting this research?" Dr. Haydock consulted a letter he had retrieved from his desk. "A firm calling itself the Genealogical Research Institute. Rather grand name for what appears to be a small London office. They've been quite aggressive in pursuing old medical records from families throughout the district." The web of deception was growing more complex by the hour. Miss Marple reflected on similar cases from her village experience. The matter of young Georgie Pritchard, who had attempted to establish his claim to old Mrs. Carruthers' estate through forged medical records, and the curious affair of the Henderson twins, whose disputed inheritance had hinged on proving which was the elder by medical documentation of their births. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Millicent Weatherby, who appeared at Dr. Haydock's surgery in a state of considerable distress. "Miss Marple?" Millicent gasped, clearly surprised to find her there. "I didn't expect— that is, I was hoping to speak with Dr. Haydock privately." Dr. Haydock regarded his patient with professional concern. "You look quite overwrought, Miss Weatherby. Perhaps you should sit down." Millicent accepted the offered chair, but remained perched on its edge, as though prepared for immediate flight. "Doctor, I need to ask you about family medical histories, about whether certain irregularities in one's background might affect one's health or one's children's health." Miss Marple observed Millicent's distress with growing understanding. The young woman was clearly tormented by fears that went far beyond concern for physical health. "My dear," Dr. Haydock said gently, "are you concerned about some specific condition?" Millicent's hands twisted in her lap. "I've been receiving letters, you see, anonymous letters suggesting that our family history contains irregularities that might have consequences I hadn't considered." Miss Marple set down her knitting entirely. "What sort of letters, Millicent?" Millicent glanced toward Dr. Haydock, who nodded encouragingly. "Letters claiming that I have no right to call myself a Weatherby, that my grandmother's parentage was questionable, and that everything we've inherited rightfully belongs to someone else." "Have you shown these letters to your mother?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Oh, no," Millicent replied quickly. "I couldn't possibly. Mother has been under such strain already in these letters. They contain such specific details about our family history, details that no stranger should know." Dr. Haydock and Miss Marple exchanged meaningful glances. The systematic campaign of intimidation was becoming clear. Someone was using their knowledge of the family secret to terrorize Millicent, while gathering information to support their own claims. "Millicent," Miss Marple said carefully, "have these letters demanded anything specific from you?" The younger woman nodded miserably. "They want me to acknowledge that our claim to the Ashford inheritance is fraudulent. They want me to sign a document renouncing any right to family heirlooms or property that might have belonged to Eleanor Ashford." The pattern was now unmistakably clear. Someone had discovered the true relationship between Eleanor Ashford and Sarah Pemberton, and was using that knowledge to establish their own claim to the Ashford estate. The theft of the emerald necklace was merely one element in a comprehensive campaign of intimidation and fraud. As Miss Marple walked home through the village that evening, she reflected on the psychology of the individuals behind this elaborate scheme. In her experience, Such complex deceptions usually arose from a combination of financial desperation and moral corruption that made the perpetrators capable of considerable cruelty. The mysterious Mr. Roberts, the planted housemaid Rose, the forged genealogical research, and the campaign of anonymous letters all pointed to an organized conspiracy with resources sufficient to pursue their goals across multiple fronts. Yet Miss Marple had observed that such elaborate schemes often contained the seeds of their own destruction. The very complexity that made them initially successful eventually provided the evidence necessary to unravel them. The key left behind by Rose troubled her particularly. In her experience, such apparently accidental clues were usually quite deliberate, either a message from someone seeking to expose the conspiracy from within, or a carefully planted piece of evidence designed to mislead the investigation. Tomorrow she decided it would be necessary to discover exactly what that mysterious key was meant to unlock. Chapter 6. The Doctor's Strange Testimony. Dr. Haydock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the following morning with the troubled countenance of a man wrestling with professional obligations and personal conscience. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room, where the morning light filtered through chintz curtains and fell upon her perpetual knitting with the same gentle persistence that she brought to unravelling the mysteries that seemed to find her with such regularity. Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock began without preamble, settling himself in the chair she indicated. I find myself in something of a quandary regarding my recent patients. Professional discretion normally prevents me from discussing such matters, but the circumstances have become rather extraordinary. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm as she regarded him with the patient attention she had learned to bestow upon those who brought her their troubles. Indeed, Doctor, I imagine the events at Thornfield Manor have proven most unsettling. Precisely so, Doctor, Haydock replied, his usually decisive manner showing signs of uncharacteristic hesitation. Both Mrs. Weatherby and her daughter have been consulting me with questions that seem quite removed from ordinary medical concerns. They've been asking about hereditary characteristics, about whether certain physical traits can be used to establish family relationships. Miss Marple's fingers paused momentarily in their work. How very curious. And what prompted such inquiries? Dr. Haydock withdrew a handkerchief and dabbed at his forehead, though the morning was hardly warm. Mrs. Weatherby specifically inquired about the reliability of using inherited physical characteristics as evidence in legal proceedings. She seemed particularly concerned about whether someone might challenge their family connections through such means. The implications were troubling indeed. Miss Marple reflected on similar situations she had observed in her own village. The matter of young Susan Hartwell, whose inheritance had been disputed, based on claims that her physical appearance didn't sufficiently resemble her supposed parents, and the curious case of the Pemberton twins, whose legacy had hinged upon establishing which bore the stronger resemblance to their departed uncle. I confess, Dr. Haydock continued, that their questions